Well, let me add my very warm welcome to the Bangalore International Centre and say thank you so much to Sri Krishna, to Shaini, to Ravi, to Udayan, and everybody who has really pulled together and made a fantastic, what will be a fantastic evening this evening. Really, really appreciate it. Thanks to you for coming out on your Monday night. But most of all, thank you to you, Amitav Ghosh. Please, one more round of applause.
Well, thank you, Julia, for doing this, and thank you all for coming. I love this this center. I was here, I think, a year or so ago, and it was just a wonderful experience because the audience here is kind of unique in its how well-informed it is and how responsive and well-read it is. So it's really just a great pleasure to be here. Thank you.
And we'll find that out later when we come to your questions. We're going to have a conversation for about half an hour or so, and then we'll come to your questions. So do have those brewing as we're talking, perhaps. It's a fantastic book. As Udayan said, that it's so wide-ranging, so thought-provoking. Let's dive deep into it, really deep into it, in terms of the push really is about a time, what you call a time of monsters. Two monsters in particular, political monsters and environmental monsters. And that combination, meaning that we're actually facing what you call a rupture in time.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, that's the title of the introduction. And it's taken from Antonio Gramsci's famous statement that, the old order is dying and the new order isn't yet born, and in between is the time of monsters. And I think we only need to look around us to see, the monstrousness of this era. I mean, everywhere you look, I mean, genocides unfolding on television, these incredible firestorms that we see in California, for example. But what's particularly important about this time is that we can know, back when Gramsci was writing, what he had in mind is fascism, really. Political monsters, you might say. But what's so particular about this time is that there's no longer a distinction between the political and the environmental. Because the very fact that these greenhouse gases are being put into the atmosphere and have been put into the atmosphere for more than 200 years, it emerges out of a certain kind of geopolitical relationship between the colonized world and the colonizers, and equally between sort of processes of colonization. So I think California is a very good example of this, because we have to think back to how the native people who'd lived there for tens of thousands of years, how they came to be, in California, literally exterminated in the most violent and ugly way. Men, women, children being hunted down by the settlers, especially during the gold rush and so on, their lands being expropriated. And, there's that process to begin with, because native peoples used fire in very interesting and important ways. And that kind of fire knowledge came to be absolutely suppressed, And they developed their own idea of how to manage wildfire, which is that, you must suppress wildfire wherever it occurs. And, so it was one system of knowledge, producing a kind of dominance over others. But over all of that, you see the sorts of political imperatives and financial incentives that arise out of a certain capitalist kind of modernity. Because, the realtors have this incredible incentive to cram more and more dwellings into small spaces. So Malibu has become incredibly densely populated with houses. And this is a new thing that happens, because before we used to talk of them as wildfires, but they're not wildfires. They leap over into settled areas, and then they get new fuel from the houses that have been built there. And there was a big Californian politician who tried to regulate the real estate industry, but they bought off all the politicians and they defeated the bill, in the House. Similarly, there was another politician. One of the problems that arises with these wildfires is that a lot of these building materials are derived from fossil fuels. So they themselves, at a certain temperature, become fuel. Like laminates, like siding, and so on. So there was another politician who tried to regulate the use of building materials. Again, fossil fuel industry, the real estate industries spent a lot of money, defeated the bill. What is really monstrous in instances like these is that the real estate industry, you can see why they will promote this model of development, because they build those houses, over, let's say, 2 or 3 years, or 1 or 2 years, or whatever, and then they get out. They're not carrying the long-term risk. The people who are carrying the long-term risk are, in this case, very wealthy people, but also lots of, very middle-class people.
And they're the people that have bought into in that circumstance, the Malibu dream. But you talk also about climate migrants, and then what you say is that actually to call it climate migrancy is actually very reductionist, because it's actually a lot more than that. And your research in Italy found that out. And part of that is about mimicry and status, and what I can see on social media, that looks great in Malibu or Italy or wherever it might be, but actually it's quite different in the reality for migrants.
Yes, that's absolutely the case. I, not just me, but several others have become very, very skeptical of these terms like climate migration and so on. Because this is a kind of reductionist thing, you just attach climate to various things and you seem to sort of put it in a certain space of discourse. But nobody moves for any single reason. I'm sure there are many in this theater, who've at various points of time in their lives moved here and there. And we know from our personal experience that it never happens just for one reason, You go because, there are push factors, pull factors, whatever. And certainly climate plays a part in that, it makes certain places difficult to inhabit. But there are just so many nuances in this that it's really, I think, misleading to speak of it purely as climate migration. So let me give you an example. Now, as you know, there are, in large parts of southern and western India, the working class now comes almost entirely from eastern India. There are, I believe, schools in Bangalore where the main language is Bengali. And this is also true in in Goa, elsewhere. Now, what happens actually within India is very interesting, because we have this pattern called circulatory migration. So they'll come here, work for a bit, maybe 6 months, maybe 12 months, then they go back to their village, and all the while they're sending money to the village, and they'll go back, they'll send their cousin. So there's a constant chain, in the same way that Indians go to the Middle East, and there's a constant chain of circulation. What happens with these migrants who are turning up in Italy or across Europe is that the way the legal system is structured, they find themselves trapped there. Because if you apply for asylum, you basically can't go back home. So actually, if you speak to these migrants, what they really want is to establish a pattern of circulatory migration. They don't really want to live there. Of the migrants I spoke to, these were, South Asian kids, really kids. 16, 17, 18, who'd taken these incredibly dangerous journeys across the Mediterranean and ended up, in this instance, in Italy. I would say 90% of them bitterly regretted having set off on this journey. But once you're there, you're kind of trapped there for many reasons.
And you say in the book that there's the dichotomy between those kids who are, it's almost a rite of passage in some ways, And back home, they're heroes, but actually, in order to get into the system and to be recognized by the system, they have to make themselves victims in the eyes of the state.
Yes, it's a bizarre thing, I mean, after all, you look at the journeys these migrants make. I mean, they're crossing the Mediterranean in these rickety boats. They're going from Sudan into Libya. Sometimes they find themselves in these slave camps, and then they escape. I mean, it's just, their lives are just filled with, in other words, if you were to frame it differently, you would say filled with adventure. I mean, these are 17, 18-year-olds, and, teenagers are drawn to a certain, especially male teenagers, are drawn to a certain kind of adventure. Now, in Bangladesh, which is actually where a lot of the migration comes from, the migration started, migration is also drawn by networks. So going back to the 19th century, when a lot of Bengalis served as lascars, on sail ships, many lascars, when they got to, let's say, Southampton or wherever, would actually decamp from the ships. And they set up entire communities. I mean, there are communities in southern Wales which go back, 150, 200 years. There's a wonderful book being written about the Bengali community in New York called Bengali Harlem. Goes back to the turn of the 19th century, and how they set up these and became very integrated into African American culture, African American music, and so on. So these networks establish, as it were, these lines of migration. So Bangladesh, Bengalis were the leaders, Bengalis and Sikhs from Punjab, because they also, through the army, created these patterns of migration into Canada and so on, and into California. So that establishes a pattern, and eventually, this has happened now in certain districts in Bangladesh, you won't see any male between the ages of 16 and 30. There's a kind of internalized pressure for them to leave, because if they don't, then they feel that they're slackers, they're not, they see from their cousins and friends who send back money how much it helps their families, and they feel this compulsion. This is also true in many parts of Africa. And what's the paradox of it, of course, is that Bangladesh is a successful economy. They have now the highest per capita GDP in all of Southern Asia. They have many of the best indicators. So it's not like it's a war-torn, state where people are fleeing because they can't survive there. That's not the case at all. So this is the interesting thing, that, within the Western discourse, they think of migration as being driven by desperation alone. But in fact, migration is often driven by prosperity. So if you see, I'm sure that was the case for many of us here. It was a relative prosperity that made it possible for us to make our journeys. And or you think of those Gujarati families, who were literally freezing to death on the Canadian borders with their children. And if you look into the histories of those families, they're middle-class families. They're perfectly well off. So something else is drawing them.
Let's talk about the Lascars and the Lascari language, because it really struck me in the book that you enjoyed looking through the etymology of that language and how that was used on board ship, and actually how it allowed what you call, I think, the first global workspace, which is a phrase that we've become used to in the modern era, but actually goes back to those ships in that time.
Well, yeah, Lascars were pioneers in every sense. They were the first to adapt to an industrial work discipline, because on board ship you have this system of watches. So for 4 hours you're on duty, and for 4 hours then you're off, and you switch with the other watch. And it's a very strict and difficult thing to adapt to, if you're not used to, as it were, clock-bound rhythms of time. So they enter the industrial process very, very early, from the 17th century onwards. And they live in very close proximity to Europeans and to others. And as I said, many of them run off and, So the interesting part of it is that, a sail ship, the whole technology of sail is very dependent on words. Because the ship is like a moving lexicon. Every time an officer calls out an order, he refers to particular sails, particular ropes, and on the really big sail ships, you could have as many as 80 sails up at the same time. And when he calls out his order, everyone has to respond instantly. Otherwise the ship can, it can just flip over. So, from a very early time onwards, Europeans started making dictionaries of sail. The earliest dictionaries you see in many European languages, but most of all the major maritime nations, the earliest dictionaries are dictionaries of sail, because there needed to be that perfect communication. So when I started researching my novels, the Ibis trilogy, I became very interested in how did this technology work in the Indian Ocean space, because the officers are always Europeans, and the sailors are, from the Indian Ocean region. They're Bengalis, they're Gujaratis, they're Malays, they're Filipinos, there are Africans, there are Persians, Arabs, etc. So I thought to myself, how do they communicate? There must have been a language. And if there was a language, then there had to have been dictionaries. And it so happened that I was doing a teaching stint at Harvard at the time, and through their system, I actually managed to track down a dictionary of the Lascari language, written in 1812 by one Lieutenant Thomas Roebuck. And it became, it was incredibly interesting because, it was full of these expressions like, "I will kick you now," that kind of thing. Like a lot of those colonial dictionaries are. But I became completely fascinated by it, and it really entered my trilogy.
Yeah. I wonder whether we're here to talk about your non-fiction, but we can't let you go without talking a little bit about fiction. So for the Ibis trilogy and other work, is it the research that sets you off in a direction? Is it an idea? Is it an image? Where does the fiction start for you?
The fiction always starts with characters, and that was certainly the case with the trilogy as well. I think one always has to remember that, for me, for example, the research is fun. I enjoy doing the research. I know my way around libraries and archives, and, it's much, much easier than writing, it's doing the research. But that's why you have to remind yourself that no one is going to read a novel for the research. No one is going to read a novel because it reveals a certain kind of history or whatever. So you have to remember always, even if you're writing a historical novel, that what drives a novel in the end is plot, is character, is all those things. Ultimately, I think the most important aspect of a novel is character, So you have to try and establish a balance, which is particularly difficult in the case of if you're writing historical fiction about Asia. If you're writing about, let's say, Tudor England, like Hilary Mantel, for example, it's easy. We all, in our heads, we have an image of what people wore, what they ate, what a court, what the buildings look like, what a court looked like, Whereas if you're writing about, let's say, 19th century China or Burma, none of us have any visual image of what people wore, what the buildings looked like, what they ate, what their ceremonies were. So that's when it becomes really difficult to find the balance, because you don't want people to go away with the impression that it was just like Europe or whatever, because it wasn't. It was completely different. How do you suggest that difference without becoming pedantic and heavy,
And you're also putting those characters in a predicament. So if we might talk about the Glass Palace for a moment, you say in Wild Fictions that actually writing about war when there are not well-defined loyalties is very difficult.
Yes, absolutely. So I think the central tension in The Glass Palace, for me, and also in Flood of Fire, which is, and a lot of the essays in this book come out of my explorations of this. Those Indians who became colonial soldiers, and what it meant for them, and how did they think of where they were in the world. And this is a very difficult thing to understand, because on the one hand, these colonial soldiers were doing what they were told by the British. They were mercenaries. They were trying to earn money. And this is a cantonment town, so we know how important a part the British military played in the colonial regime. At the same time, one of the most remarkable things about the colonial soldiery is that they were constantly in revolt. You have all these rebellions going through all the time. Throughout the 18th, 19th centuries. Of course, they reach a peak in 1857 when they really turned against the British and tried to create their own independent world. But, it went on. There were minor revolts all along, almost every decade there's but, these revolts the British were very careful in how they managed the army, so that sepoys were never allowed to have their guns with them. Unlike British soldiers, the sepoys' guns had to be locked up at night. The sepoys weren't allowed to shoot cannon. They were allowed to load the cannon, but the actual shooting was done by what they call topazes, that is a Portuguese-descended, you might say Eurasians. So there was a very strict racial hierarchy in how you handled weapons. But the sepoys, of course, managed, they stormed the arsenals, they got hold of their weapons and did what they could. So, there's this incredible dualism. And I became very interested because my father fought in the British Indian Army in the Second World War. And he was in Burma, he was in North Africa, and he told lots of stories about it. But I became very interested in what happened to the soldiers who joined the Indian National Army. And there's a misconception that the Indian National Army was founded by Subhas Chandra Bose, but it wasn't. It was actually founded by a Sikh officer called Mohan Singh, And the way that it happened is very strange because on the eve of the Second World War, essentially Malaya and Singapore were defended by about 250,000 Indian soldiers, The British thought that the Japanese attack would come from the south. So those of you who've been in Singapore will have seen that the British cannon from that era were pointing southwards, and all their defenses were geared for a southward attack. But what the Japanese did, as a military campaign, it was completely brilliant. They went up to the narrow end of the Malay Peninsula. They went through Thailand, which was sort of in alliance with them. So they went through Thailand and attacked from the north. And what they did is that they found these extraordinary ways of moving. So basically, they just swarmed down from the north on bicycles, So they came against these heavily prepared British positions, which were looking southwards, but they came in from the north. And they completely stormed, within a few weeks. Now, for the Indian soldiers who were in it, one of the reasons why they fought with the British was that the British always won. And now here suddenly...
Not so much.
not so much. So for them, on this particular battlefield called Jitra in northern Malaya, that was where the British suffered this epical defeat. And I was one of the last people, I think, to interview Colonel Harbaksh Singh Dhillon, who was one of the Red Fort 3. And it was so interesting to get his take on what they went through at that moment, how they imagined themselves. And then when they when they suddenly realized that, look, all my life I've been an instrument of someone else's purposes. That's the most humiliating thing that any human being can ever reckon with. And so when they formed the Indian National Army, there was a kind of rage in them that never relented. So after they made the transition, they just fought the British till the bitter end. In Burma, most of all, I mean, they made their last stand on Mount Popa, which is where the Glass Palace basically ends. And yeah.
You've also, within Wild Fictions, excavated two very special memoirs, really, Bengali memoirs, and really brought those out into the light. Tell us about those two and why they're important, because they get over something along the lines of the sort of silence in the archive that you intimated earlier.
Yeah, absolutely. So, going back to my college years, I loved First World War memoirs. It started with First World War poetry, by Siegfried Sassoon and Robert Graves and all those people. And I loved reading that stuff. And then when I started writing the Ibis trilogy, I started looking for first-hand accounts written by Indian soldiers. And it's an extraordinary thing. I mean, Indian sepoys served in European armies going back to the 17th century. They served the Dutch, they served the French, they served the English. And altogether, over the next 3 centuries, millions of Indians served European masters in one way or the other. And many of these were literate men, many of them were Brahmins, etc. And yet, there's only one apocryphal memoir written by an Indian soldier. It's called Sitaram Subedar, and there's a big dispute about whether it was actually written by an Englishman because the only version that exists is in English. Though a wonderful Awadhi writer has translated that version into Awadhi. Madhukar Upadhyay is his name. And it's a beautiful, I never thought I'd be able to read Awadhi, but when I started reading the Awadhi version, I loved it. Anyway, so Sitaram Subedar, that's the only thing that exists. So trying to imagine the life worlds of an Indian soldier is very difficult because it was nothing like European soldiers. For many Indian soldiers, it was actually almost a spiritual. For many Muslim soldiers, for many Hindu soldiers, there was a very powerful spiritual element in soldiering. And actually, many of the soldiers were themselves, they belonged to various sadhu orders and so on. So it's a very difficult world to imagine, So I started looking for these, looking to see if there were any memoirs written by Indians. But actually the memoirs started to be written after the turn of the 19th century, so early 20th century. The first one is actually about, written by a guy called Thakur Gadadhar Singh, and it's set in the Boxer Rebellion, because of course these guys went and put down the Boxer Rebellion. And then you get the First World War. And there I started looking, and I came upon the work of a wonderful academic, I think a really great literary critic, called Shantanu Das, who is now a fellow of All Souls College at Oxford. And through his writings, I came upon two memoirs written in Bangla. So, Bengalis weren't actually taken into the British Indian Army at this point because they had all these racial categorizations. But these two guys who wrote this, they were medical personnel. One was a doctor in the Indian Medical Service, the other was an ambulance guy. And so the doctor, he was an incredibly interesting, reflective man. He wrote long letters which he sent back home to his mother. And his mother, his grandmother, was a fairly well-known literary figure. Her name was Mukhoda Devi. And she was a Brahmo Samaji, you know, like Rabindranath Tagore and so on. So she, after he died, so what happened is, almost the first action that the British took in the First World War was to send an Indian contingent, an expeditionary force, to basically seize the oil fields of the Gulf. The Maratha regiment was actually the main component, but there were lots of, other, especially medical personnel, camp followers, and so on. So they arrived in Basra, and in 1915, and at first it seemed that they were just defeating the Ottoman armies, very easily. So they went up and up and up, the central plain. Then finally they came to a place called Kut al-Amara, where they ran into a very carefully prepared Turkish position. And there they were encircled and surrounded and besieged. And they had like a few weeks provisions, but they were besieged for over 4 months. They were absolutely starving. And this was said to be the greatest battlefield defeat that the British Empire had ever suffered until that point. So they were taken captive, and they were taken northwards, to POW camps in northern Syria. And both these writers were taken to these camps, and one of them, the doctor, was called Kullan Mukherjee, and from there also they could send letters back. So one of the most interesting things about Kullan Mukherjee is that on the eve of the Battle of Kut al-Amara, he wrote this long letter to his grandmother, where he writes this impassioned denunciation of nationalism and its sort of links with capitalism. And many of you will know Rabindranath Tagore later also wrote a very powerful denunciation of a certain kind of chauvinistic nationalism. And I feel absolutely sure that his views were informed by Kullan Mukherjee, because the Brahmos were a small circle, so knowledge of the letters must have circulated. But this is a particularly sort of a moving letter. Anyway, so then they get moved north to Ras Al Ain. This is happening 1915, 1916. So this coincides with the peak of the Armenian genocide. And the Kullan Mukherjee doesn't mention the Armenian genocide, but the other man, whose name is Shishir Shorbodikari, he, in his book, and the story of his book is amazing. He used to make notes on little scraps of paper, which he had to hide from the Turkish captors. So he would stuff them into his shoes. And that was how he managed to bring these scraps of paper out. And he wrote his account of it basically like 40 years after the experience. But it's a very well-written, very interesting and powerful memoir. So he writes about the Armenian genocide at some length, because he and his people, they saw it unfolding in front of their eyes. And I wrote about it, and somehow the Armenians heard about it, and they invited me to go to their, to do a sort of keynote address at their anniversary celebration, commemoration of the Armenian genocide. I think it was 2012. Yeah, so that's in this book as well.
It's just fantastic to be able to read that, and it really jumps off the page. Right, it is time now for your questions. So if we might raise the house lights, that would be wonderful. We have microphones. I'm sure you've got questions. If I could ask that they are questions rather than comments, that would be wonderful. If we can keep them really crisp and crunchy, because I'm sure there'll be plenty. There's a questions straight away down here, and then we'll come to you in a second. Is there somebody over here we can get a mic? There's a down here next. Yeah, off you go.
Thanks both for a really fascinating conversation. It's a question for both of you, actually. Julia, with you as a BBC... sorry, it's a question for both of you. You as a BBC correspondent, and Amitav, just because you've got a brain the size of a planet. Asif Kapadia's new film, 2073, is a warning back to 2024 about something called the event, which wasn't just one thing. It's about the deficit of democracy. It's about the techno-autocracy and climate change. Now, I think we're already in the event, and especially with Trump being inaugurated today. Is it too late to do anything?
I'll let you take that one first.
Well, I think there can be no doubt that we're living through the end of the world as we knew it. But that doesn't mean the end of the world per se, you know. Actually, if you listen to, or if you try and examine what these tech billionaires are actually saying about how they conceive of the event, it's really chilling. I mean, it's, you know, because they don't attribute it to climate change by any means. I mean, for them, there are these series of interlocked crises. You know, for some reason, runaway AI is one of their big concerns. Then there's also self-replicating nanobots, which they're really terrified of because it produces this gray goo. Please do look up the gray goo scenario. I love that idea that they have. But you know, when you listen to their to what they're thinking about the future, there's a kind of absolute absurdity to it. You know, I mean, so their planning involves these getaway bunkers, you know, on faraway islands. And they get very angry if they're talked about. Mark Zuckerberg has just bought a whole island in Hawaii where he's building this enormous getaway bunker with self-sustaining agricultural systems and you know, all the rest of it. And the plan is that when the event occurs and everything is collapsing, the billionaire and his family will get onto their private jet, which will take them to this island, and they'll go to this island and they'll live it out for like 2 or 3 years. And then after you know, a large part of the world has either died or killed each other off, they'll re-emerge and they'll take over the world again. Now, you know, you just think of it. I mean, if the world is collapsing, how will you get to your plane? I mean, if your airport is jammed with burnt-out vehicles or whatever, how will your plane take off? And then when you arrive there, presumably if the world has collapsed, all the monetary systems have also collapsed. And it's true that they hire these sort of private armies to assure their security. But once this collapse has occurred, why would, I mean, the private security has the guns. The billionaire doesn't have the guns. Why will the private security listen to them? You know, they'll immediately lock them up or shoot them or whatever and grab all their stuff. I mean, you know.
They just haven't thought it through.
But, you know, it's not just billionaires. This is a huge growth industry. Now in America, you can buy your own, you know, apocalypse bunker for $35,000.
Is it called prepping?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, they're survivalists and preppers and so on, and they're all preparing, you know, to go into their apocalypse bunkers.
I'm just going to say there has to be hope. There was a question just here. Yeah,
Yes.
off you go.
I have a specific question. I'm a huge fan of your Ibis trilogy, and I had the privilege of talking about it to my book club.
Oh, wow.
And I just wanted to ask you, are there links between the Ibis trilogy and the essays in Wild Fictions? And if so, what are they?
There are innumerable links, actually. You know, some of the essays on language, which also connect to the Ibis trilogy. Then these other essays, you know, for example, these First World War essays, I came upon them in the course of especially researching Flood of Fire, you know, the lives of soldiers. Yeah, so there are multiple forms of connection with the Ibis trilogy. Thank you.
Love this. You will love it. Yes, a question over here.
Hi, sir. My question is a literary one because I really wish to ask you one. Could you tell me?
Could you hold up your hand? I can't, I'm not sure. Okay, I got it. Yeah.
Is there one or more modern Bengali writers whom you relate to in your fiction which you write in English? That's my question.
Yes, very much, very much. Shunil Gangopadhyay, who was perhaps one of the best-known writers in Bengal, he was a close friend and I would say a mentor, and I really looked up to his work. Mahashita Devi, her work was very important and meaningful for me because, like many writers of her generation, like Shivrama Karanth, for example, she was writing about the environment, and about people who lived in forests in the 50s, 60s. Advaita Mollo Borman, who was a Dalit writer, writing about the lives of fishermen. All these writers were very important to me.
Thank you. There's a question just over here. If we could get the mic there. Keep your hand up. Oh, sorry, I didn't realise you. We'll come back to the top in a second. And then is there somebody over here that we can get a mic to? Great.
Hi, Amitav. I'm Shashwat. Lovely to see you talk, actually. Your brain really is a planet. My question is more to do with sort of, say, your personal own spirituality, since you do consume a lot of knowledge. And just today you spoke about movements of scale, right, in terms of migration. And your first chapter is titled Rupture in Time. So we are talking about transcendental events at societal scale that we are currently going through. So I just wanted to know, since you do read a lot of history, you do a lot of research, and you have sort of this insight into the micro within macro movements, how would you say, where is society headed spiritually in this time, which is full of monsters? Do you see spiritually it'll lead to a time of liberation, as currently we also are a highly aware society. There's a lot of knowledge dissemination happening at scale.
Okay.
So do you think we are leading towards spiritual abundance or spiritual scarcity? That's my question for you. Yeah.
Thank you.
That's a very interesting and a very good question. Like I'm sure everybody in this theater, I'm sure everybody here is very highly educated, has been through universities and so on. I was from a very early age sort of indoctrinated into a sort of modernist way of looking at the world. And the fundamental aspect of this modernist way of looking at the world was that the world was a machine. You imagine the world as being inert, as having no essential life of its own. So the only sort of thinking beings, I guess we completely accepted a Cartesian view that the only thinking beings were humans. And I think one of the really productive things that's come out of climate change, and certainly for me personally, my grappling with climate change, is that it's shown us how profoundly wrong that view was. It was just completely mistaken. The world is a living entity. Everything that our grandmothers told us is right. Trees do think. Now we know that, actually through botanical research. So in many ways, I would say that, reconnecting, for me as for many other people in the world, reconnecting, just seeing, exactly what climate change has done and what it has revealed to us, the world that is completely different from the world as I was taught about it in school and college and so on. It sort of reconnected me with my childhood way of thinking, with the beliefs and practices that I was brought up in. And, my parents were, I suppose they would describe themselves as Hindus, and they were actually very sort of devout. Our lives were filled with these rituals and pilgrimages and so on. But actually, their beliefs were not, I think, Hindu in the sense that if you read a book about Hinduism, you'll be handed certain, we never talked about Atma or Brahma or any of these things. So when I read those books, they make no sense to me, whatever. our beliefs were in very local things. You know, I mean, in literally the vibrancy of local things. It was basically, and I say this with the greatest pride, it was basically animism, you know? And the only book that I've seen that reflects this particular kind of awareness of the world is a book. I don't know that it's been published yet, but I got sent a PDF of it. It's by a historian, anthropologist called Tithi Bhattacharya. She teaches somewhere in America. And she really describes the world that I was born into, you know, a world that was filled with spirits and ghosts and demons and all sorts of presences, you know. And I think it's because even though I was very much sort of acclimated or brainwashed into a certain kind of mechanistic thinking, that part of me has always remained. Some part of me has always remained. And I find myself drawing on that more and more now.
Thank you. There's a question just here.
I had the chance to live with some pastoralists recently, and the things that you were talking about in relation to knowing how to handle fire, and even just the existence of a single memoir. What draws you to just this magic of these forgotten histories?
What draws me to them is precisely that they are magical. You know, I mean, I think this is another thing that climate change has really taught us, that, you know, magic is real, that these things inhere in the earth. It's just that we have been taught to silence our awareness of these things, you know. They've always existed around us. And, you know, they've always existed, I mean, for the great, for thousands of years, since our species came into being, when we had felt some kinship with the world of animals, because the world of animals, they're very aware of these presences that are all around us, you know. You know, we had this awareness, and it continued forever. I mean, you know, for example, even in Christianity, there was such a powerful awareness of angels. That was true of Islamic faiths as well. For us, it was the devas, if you like, or also the demons and the so on. So that awareness always existed, but we were taught to suppress it. You know, we were taught to make the world into, you know, a clockwork universe. And now we see it's not a clockwork universe. Not at all. It's a universe that's lashing out at us in all kinds of very powerful ways.
Thank you. Question up the top there, yes.
Thank you. Sorry. I have a question about how you navigate the reductivity, but also the instrumentality of the label climate migrant. So when you're speaking to people, when you hear that word used, to what extent do you engage in explaining the systemic nature behind it? That yes, it's climate, but it's also all of these socioeconomic oppressions and our responsibility in it. And to what extent do you leave be, at least what I'm seeing sometimes, the responsibility that it engenders? I live in Italy, and I see people say, yeah, you've migrated here, but I also would migrate if my house was flooded or if it were 45 degrees, and I see people coming to the defense because they feel a collective responsibility for climate change. How do you navigate that when you see that narrative around you?
Thank you.
There are so many aspects to that I don't really even know where to begin. But if you're looking for a good place for a critique of the concept of climate migration, Camelia Dewan, who's an anthropologist writing about Bangladesh, she's written very strongly about that. So you might want to look into that. But actually, I must say, coming back to some of the earlier questions, one thing that I became very interested in during, in trying to understand what was happening in the heads of these young migrants, is that there's a very powerful supernatural element in these migrations, Supernatural in what sense? Well, in my essay in migration, on migration in this book, I quote, an interview that an NPR, American Public Radio, journalist does with this young migrant from, I think it's Senegal or something. A place where, this migrant had a perfectly good life, but he decided that he wanted to travel. And there are these two cities in Morocco that you may know of. They're called Ceuta and Melilla. These are Spanish enclaves within Morocco. And they're very heavily guarded with like 7 layers of walls and fences and everything. But over the years, an enormous number of migrants have been drawn to these two cities. So there's encampments of thousands of migrants around these cities. And every now and then, they'll throw themselves on these wires and try to climb over. So this NPR journalist actually interviews this young African guy who, after repeated attempts, finally manages to throw himself over the top. He arrives in Melilla or Ceuta, then he ends up in Spain. And the journalist asks him, well, why did you do it? And he said, well, it was like an adventure. It was like something that I had to do. So what he's essentially saying is that it becomes like a ritual of adulthood. Of finding adulthood in the world, just like, as I said, a lot of these young migrants set off. And then the guy asks him, but weren't you afraid of this fence? And he said, no, that fence is a living thing. We had to try to scale it because it was there. It's actually a completely sort of surreal language that he uses there. But certainly I saw with many of these young migrants that, one of the strangest aspects of the supernatural is actually inside their cell phone. So, when they're in this boat, which is kind of sinking, they're looking at their cell phone and they become disembodied. They think that they're not corporeal beings, that they themselves are inside the cell phone, and therefore nothing can happen to them. So, this is what I mean. There's experience, human experience derives from living in a body. Your body, you can't leave or escape your body. But your cell phone gives you the impression that you can. Your entire life comes to be stored in this cell phone. And it's it's a profoundly disruptive thing that's happened to them.
Thank you for giving us an hour away from our cell phones is the first thing that I'm going to say. And what a wonderful hour it's been. So wonderfully brought round circular to the end of the conversation, tying up the beginning. This book is fantastic. You're going to be doing a book signing outside. I thoroughly recommend, hard recommend, as they say in the United States, I think. Thank you to you for coming. Thanks to everybody here at the Bangalore International Centre, at the festival and at HarperCollins. Remember, everybody, magic is real. Please say thanks once again to Amitav Ghosh.
Thank you, Julia. You were great.